Welcome to this, the fourth in our series of online training sessions from the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community from the Institute of Historical Research. My name is Dr. Adam Chapman and I am the Principal Editor of the Victoria County History. And I'd like to thank you all for giving up your afternoons to listen to both to me and our expert tutors, Angus Winchester and Sue Oosthuizen. This session is on analysing historic settlement and some which is a fairly fundamental thing to what the Victoria County History does, and I'll be introducing that briefly first. Then we'll have contributions from Professor Sue Oosthuizen and then Professor Angus Winchester talking about giving us lots of examples of case studies and things you can look for in your landscapes and settlement around you. So do make yourselves comfortable and settle down. This should be a really fascinating session, even though I'm talking in a bit of it. And we will be getting underway in, there's still a couple of people coming in. So once they've finished joining, which they have now, we will begin. So if you're all sitting comfortably, and I can get the share screen to work. So from beginning. There we go. Right. So what I'm going to be doing is a very brief introduction to the use of settlement, predominantly a settlement as a tool for historical inquiry, and how we do it, and what the purposes to which we put that in the context of the histories which the Victoria County History publish. This is all very simply, assuming it'll actually go on. There we go. Very simply, when we're describing the history of individual parishes, which is what the Victoria County History, or VCH, has always done, we've always included some elements of historical landscape and settlement analysis, even on a very, very basic level. But now it forms a key part of the introduction to all our parish histories. So what are these histories? Well, first a couple of examples, one of which has been published by the VCH and one of which has not. So the first is Westmill, a parish in Hertfordshire towards the Cambridge border, which demonstrates a lot of the things you'll find in rural settlements. You have boundaries of the parish defined by a Roman road or by arbitrary lines cutting across natural and man-made features, which could indicate ancient features. These are not necessarily associated with settlements. The landscape includes some religious elements, and notably the parish church. There is a village. Not every settlement consists of a village, but some just dispersed houses. So where is that? How is that influenced by the morphology, in this case heavy clay, and the subsequent infill of settlement as the population grows? Westmill is always also interesting because you can see little examples of small sort of sub-settlements which nucleate around individual farms or perhaps land holdings, intermixed with agriculture and woodland. The relic of enclosed open field systems which imply a degree of communal cooperation and, of course, reflect where things actually are, where settlement is actually created. And finally, but also very importantly, as you can see, a Roman road going straight through the middle, that straight linear feature cutting through the middle of it, transport and communications networks. Come on. Sorry, my computer's running a little slowly. There we go. Second example, which is not a place the VCH has dealt with yet, but is very conveniently just down the road from where I'm speaking to you now, is a map of Tunbridge in Kent, which is a classic settlement type, which is a medieval castle borough. In this case, on the upper reach of the River Medway, commanding a north-south route over the Kentish Weald. The river crossing is ancient, but the bridge that's currently there dates from the 1880s, but is replaced several earlier structures. So within the town itself, you can see in the southwest corner the motte of the Norman castle and its accompanying bailey, backing onto the river. You can see the outline from there of the town wall, preserved rather clearly, actually, in sort of going up from the southwest, diagonally to the northwest, and then across what is now a street of Victorian terraced houses, which weren't built when this map was created, which is Lansdowne Road. Reaches the main road and then heads back down what is called Bourdyke, which I only realised the other day in a fit of sort of absent-mindedness is actually from Latin for boreal, Latin for north, borealis. So it is the north dike, the north ditch of the town. And this encloses, and this then it heads, then the ditch and the wall that presumably accompanied it headed back down to the river in the south. This is a planned settlement, and you can see that from either side of the main street, which widens towards the river, indicating where the marketplace once was. These long, thin strips, characteristically called burgage plots. These are characteristic of Norman castle development. So there is, all these of course exist today. These plots are basically still there. The church is more or less opposite the castle. So the symbols of secular and spiritual authority are in proximity and conversation with one another. But the town, as you can see, was really quite small, and it's subsequently grown hugely. So that is this medieval town, this effectively medieval town plan you can see existing in the 1860s is still there, but is now surrounded by 19th and 20th and even 21st century development. Come on. There we go. So let's give it an illustration of how settlement descriptions and accounts of historic settlement have appeared within the VCH. Let's go to somewhere that is a couple of examples which are now of medieval settlement, really, which are now lost. One is obviously Milton Keynes, so scene of one of the 1960s new towns developed in the midst of Britain's countryside, which, when we got around to it in 1927, but probably written a few years earlier, was a parish of nearly 2,000 acres, mostly partly about a quarter under arable cultivation and about 3/4 under permanent grass, much roughly what you expect from northern Buckinghamshire, and a very brief account of the village, and this is the sort of sum total of description of the place that's being described as the people who lived there in 1927 would have known it, which is very typical of the VCH at the time. So, but it does show some inklings to why it was chosen as the site of a new town. It's flat, the soil is, the agricultural soil isn't much good, and it's close to some principal communications links, i.e. the old A1 as it was then, now the M1, and what is now known as the West Coast Main Line, which didn't go through the parish as constituted then, with some sort of indication of what was there at the time. And the reason for this sort of concentration on buildings is because these were prepared by the architectural editors of the series who they were the people that actually visited the places we were discussing. But you can see that even at this point, we're interspersing that physical detail with some details from historical research and documentary material. To move on to another lost medieval settlement, although it's only sort of lost. It is still there, you know where to look, which is somewhere else I lived at one point, which is Ealing and Brentford, which in the period in the period of this map in the 1780s is a village about 10 miles west of London, which is what it still was until the 1840s when the Great Western Railway turned up. And you can see that in the centre of the parish, there is a small village, that is Ealing. Now, if you know Ealing at all, this is roughly where South Ealing Tube Station is, with a church, a green, backing onto Ealing Common, and a small cluster of houses which formed the village of Ealing. The Uxbridge Road goes west and is lined with a few scattered houses, and there are small sort of subsidiary settlements at Little Ealing, Ealingbury, Ealing Dean and Drayton Green, and the linear settlement along the Thames at Old Brentford, which forms the sort of principal urban focus of the then parish. And here we can see these are taken from the VCH Middlesex volume. It's by a process known as map regression, or in this case progression, because we're working forwards in time. You can see how this had changed already by the 1820s, with an increase in urban development around Brentford in the south, and along the west, the London Road, gradually growing up along the road towards Ealing. By 1876, 1877, you can see that not one but two railways have appeared, crossing the parish, going east-west. To the north is the Great Western Railway, out towards Bristol. And to the south is what is now the Hounslow Loop, which goes towards Hounslow in the west, and towards Barnes in the east. And again, you can see more, and where the railways come through, you can see an increased level of development around there. Moving on to 1914, before still most of the urban development that is there now, we can see that there is a large amount of suburban development. Ealing is now called Ealing is called now the Queen of the Suburbs. But you can see preserved in that landscape are some of the names of things some of the names and features that are lost. The Church of St Mary's was rebuilt in the 19th century, but still retains some medieval fabric if you know where to look. But it's a massive, great brick thing by SS Toulon. The River Brent is still a feature in the landscape and defines the northern parish boundary. But the settlement has changed in character, in size, and in scale, and in purpose. This is no longer an agricultural community. This is a residential community served by the railways and looking towards London. And W.G. Hoskins, when in Making the English Landscape, includes some rather charming letters from inhabitants of Ealing describing this transformation. Further change occurred later. Between the First and Second World Wars, you find the development of the north of Ealing Broadway in the north is sort of a focus of retail industry and business. To the east of the parish, you find the development of the Great North Circular Road, and after the Second World War, you find the development of the Great West Road, further delineating the lived experience of the place. So the settlement becomes, rather than something in the midst of open fields looking outwards, it becomes hemmed in to the north, the south, and the east and the west by large swathes of residential development, but also by physical infrastructure of roads and railways. And of course, also the Thames is ever present. So that is enough from me. So I'm going to stop screen sharing for a second and hand over to our speakers, who know far more about these subjects than I do, having been practitioners in the field for some time. Our first speaker is Professor Sue Oosthuizen, who's Professor Emeritus of Medieval Archaeology at the University of Cambridge Institute of Continuing Education. Her teaching and research has focused on rights of common and on development of the English landscape from about 400 to about 1300 AD. She's the author of Landscapes Decoded in the University of Hertfordshire Press in 2006, but more recently the Anglo-Saxon Fenland, which was published in 2017, which is a fantastic exploration into the development and early history of that very distinctive East of England landscape. And her most recent book is The Emergence of the English, which was published by Archaeology Press in 2019. So, Sue, I would be delighted to hand over to you.
Thank you, Adam. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for letting me be here today. I'm looking forward to today. And this is going to be my slideshow. And I can get it going. There we go. So this is my topic for today on analysing historic settlement, and I've been asked to talk especially about nucleated settlement. So I'll come to those definitions in a while. I just want to show you the map, roughly speaking, of where we're going today. For some reason, my one doesn't want to go forward either. What's that about? So this is the structure for today. Something by way of introduction. Something about the topography, the rises and the falls of the land, the underlying geology and drainage and how important those are in landscape history. Morphology, that is the layout, the analysis of the layout of a settlement. And those are the topics I'd like to talk about within them. Something about some other sources, and then a conclusion. So that's roughly the map of where we're going to be going in the next 45 minutes or so. Well, now, what is nucleation? A nucleated settlement is, largely speaking, where all the settlement of a parish or a land unit is located in one place. So here is Polebrook in Northamptonshire, and you can see that by and large, the settlement is here around the church and the other major buildings of the parish. You will see some outlying houses and farms. By and large, but not always, they tend to be the product of enclosure. So that once the big medieval fields were enclosed and people were allotted areas of land to farm privately, then very often they built a farmhouse in that land outside, away from the nucleated settlement. But nucleation is where everybody more or less lives in the same place. And so I've got two other maps to show you a comparison between nucleated and non-nucleated landscapes, and they're all presented to you at exactly the same scale. So this is Polebrook in Northamptonshire. This is, excuse me, this is Clavering in Essex. And here you can see the village of Clavering, more or less in the center of the map. But look at all the other little settlements, art settlements around. Very often they're called something green or something end, and those are quite distinctive of what are called dispersed settlements, which are dispersed around the landscape. Now that's Clavering, so definitely not a nucleated settlement. And then even more extreme is Cornwall. And I've colored in the parish boundary there just to show you how extremely dispersed settlement can be in some parts of Britain. So we're looking only at dispersed settlement, and dispersed settlement tends to have a very distinctive distribution across England. Now, this is a map made by Professor Brian Roberts and Dr. Stuart Rathmell in about 2000 and 2002. Whoops a daisy. And if you have a look at the map on the left, which are maps of nucleated settlements, you can see that they've found predominantly in this band, which runs, roughly speaking, from southwest to northeast. It doesn't mean there are no nucleated settlements outside that area. Clearly there are, but the area with the most nucleations tend to be in the central area, which they call the central province. Dispersed settlement, by contrast, they also map that. And here you can see dispersals largely occur outside the central province. Here they are. But once again, if you look carefully, you can see there are instances of dispersal within the central province. So it's not an either or, it's not a Marmite question. It's not either nucleation or dispersal. It's a tendency to more nucleation in the central province and less outside, and more dispersal outside the central province than within. So where you're living may be nucleated, but outside the central province, and that's really interesting. You can start asking why that should be. Why does yours buck the trend of the nucleations around you? So just something briefly about landscape history. Landscape history is a discipline where you're very unlikely to find the answer in a single source. It's a question of finding multiple pieces of evidence, each as lightly weighted as a feather. And you hope that most of the feathers will fall into one side of that balance. And then on the balance of probability, your answer will fall in that direction. Even when you've got as much as you possibly can be, you're very unlikely to be able to say that that was the answer. All you can say is, it's the best fit hypothesis for the available evidence. And then if another piece of evidence should come along that contradicts it, well, actually, that's jolly exciting. And then you need, that makes for an interesting argument. If more comes that confirms it, all to the better. But evidence is what it is. So you don't want to start off saying, well, I know that my village started off like whatever it is, and therefore it did. You start off by asking, show me the evidence, and then we'll see where it takes us. And the more evidence there is on one side of that balance, the better. And that's the fundamental principle, because there isn't an answer in a bottle. You're not going to find a bottle which says, here I am in 1086, and we planted the village now. You're never going to find that. So it's always the best fit hypothesis. So starting with the topography, the geology, and drainage. So these are really the three fundamental sources. The marvelous Ordnance Survey footpaths map. So these are the, I can never remember, the 1 to 25,000. They're the ones that will show footpaths, parish boundaries, and contours. Those are the ones to have. The larger scale, the smaller scale ones that show the main roads in red and the smaller roads in orange are not really so interesting. This is the one you want, or even more detailed ones. Then the Geological Survey also prints geological maps, and those are really worth having, as I'm going to show you. And then down here, the Environment Agency, here's the link, also shows maps of areas liable to flooding. And those are very interesting in low-lying areas, because clearly, if you're going to build a house, you don't want to build it in the blue area. But that might not be visible in the modern landscape. So having that there was quite a nice thing to do. I'm just going to show you a couple examples of how useful these, particularly the two on the left, are for this. So this is Linton in Cambridgeshire, and there's a river running from bottom left to top right, running through it. And here's the village, you can see it. And if you look at the contour lines, you can see that the village lies at the bottom of really quite a steep slope. Look how close those contour lines are to one another. The closer they are, the steeper the slope. So it's at the bottom of a very steep slope and right down against the river. But when you plot the high ground, suddenly you can see how the river, how the village is located just about where the slope ends. The lines become further apart, more or less at this level. So I do this exercise every time I start working on a new place. And there isn't any set rule. Roughly speaking, look at the map, divide the contours roughly into thirds, but only where it makes sense to do that. You know, if it's not quite thirds, don't worry about it. Choose something that looks, that makes sense to you. Do it roughly into thirds and color in the top third, which is what I've more or less done here. And then also the bottom third, which I've done there. And then you have an idea of the landscape as a three-dimensional entity, which is hugely important if you're going to start looking, for example, at parish boundaries, at roads and so on, and also at how they use the land. So here you can see in Linton, the village is located right at the bottom of that steep slope where it starts leveling out. But look how closely it follows the floodplain of the river. It's practically exactly on the edge of the floodable land. And that, you know, if you hadn't colored that in, you wouldn't know that. So it's really worth looking at it. This is another one. Darn it. And this is another one. This would be another one, if I could do it. Yeah. Oh yes, and then the geology. And the geology shows exactly the same thing. So here we are, the village is down here. It lies on chalk. And then it lies just on the very edge of an area of alluvial silts and gravels, which the river has brought down over the years, and also beds of gravel, which are the relics of glacier, and the work of glaciers. So it lies right at the edge, at the interface between the alluvial and the chalk. So now this one is a quite different sort of landscape. This is March in the Fens, and the medieval village lay here, just to the south of the River Nene, and then here along the banks of the Nene. Once more, when you color the lowest in, this land lies all below sea level. So this is land that would have been permanently flooded before drainage throughout the Middle Ages. But if you look at the white area only lies between sea level and 5 meters above sea level. So this was land that flooded every year, sometime between autumn and spring, and quite often in the summer as well. So what were they doing? Building their house on what looked, or the houses on what looked like a floodplain. It's absolutely insane, until you have a look at the geology map. And what the geology map shows you is that the settlement to the south of the Nene, which is on the flattest part of the geography, lies on a very narrow strip of gravel. And what they did then was to dig a ditch to the west and another ditch to the east, so that when the area did flood, they were able to divert that water away from them And the water also drained away very quickly because it lay on gravel. They didn't do that on the north of the river, because to the north of the river, that area lies on a substantial bank of upcast from the river itself. There's a really high bank there, so it was never in danger of flooding. But this area to the south was. So the geology and the OS map together tell you something very important about why the village was located there. And then lastly, this is Balsham in Cambridgeshire. And here's the village, the nucleated settlement. And you can see that it lies at the top of a series of valleys which flow away downwards from it. So it lies on the highest land between areas of low ground which fall away to the west, to the southeast, and up to the northwest. And if you look at the geology map, it shows you why that, how that landscape was formed. So you can see that fundamentally the area that I've colored in brown is chalk, and the area that isn't colored in brown, the white area, is clay, which lies on top of the chalk. Balsham's got something quite interesting additionally about it, and that is that there aren't any springs up there, but there are large ponds. Now, why would you get ponds at the very top of a clay plateau? And the reason you can see is in Peter Warner's excellent diagram from his book on clayland colonization in Suffolk. And here you can see this is at the top of a plateau here. Southerton Moor lies at the top of a plateau, but there's a little bit of high ground on one side and another little bit of high ground on the other, which means that Southerton lies in a bowl which doesn't easily drain. The water collects there when it rains, but it can't flow down because it's prevented, the land dries there because it lies in a bowl. And I think that's why one gets these strings of ponds across Balsham. It's because although it's on high ground, that high ground is uneven, and there are places where the water just can't drain downwards. And that in turn explains the field names in the area. So wherever there is brown, those were arable fields. But here in the white area, these field names are all to do with pasture. So a layer is a lea is pasture, pasture studded with trees. Look, there's another one there, and those trees tend to be ashes. There's an area of woodland, wood for pigs. 200 pigs is unmanaged woodland, according to Rackham. And stocking is from our word stick, and so it's an area of woodland that has been cut down. The hay comes from the same root as our word hedge, and it means an enclosure for one reason or another. And then, of course, you've got Oxcroft up at the top, which I like because, of course, it mentions the oxen. And Yole, I don't know what it is. I looked it up, but I can't find it. But anyway, it's a very old name. It's been there since the medieval period. So all the grazing is up on the clays, on the high clays where the ponds are, and all the arable is down on the slopes running down from it. And you wouldn't know this so easily, wouldn't be able to see it so easily without the OS map and the geological map. So then we come to the landscape itself and sources for it. If you're going to read anything about landscape history, this is the book that you absolutely must read. There is nothing like it. It was published in 1983. Anything you can read by Christopher Taylor is an education. It's got lots of really practical explanations of how he analyzed settlements that he looked at. I think very few people have the experience of landscape that he has. So, you know, honestly, if you're interested, if you don't know anything about landscape history, and this is where you want to start, go and get this book. Unfortunately, only available secondhand, but Mr. ABE Books has loads. Well, it often has loads, except when I've been talking about it. Right, so let's have a look. So I'm going to have a look at some other sources. So this, of course, is the VCH, which Adam's already talked about. They don't exist for all counties yet. And some of them are rather old, but the more modern ones are absolutely fabulous. So if you're lucky enough to live in a parish which has got a modern VCH, you'll find entries on population, very often introduction, on manners, on the history, on the economic history, that's about farming, the fields, pasture, and so on. Local government, not quite my thing, so I don't pay a lot of attention to that, I'm afraid. Well, and something on the church, of course, very interesting, because you need to know who owns the land. And again, then these two kind of out of time, mostly medievalists, so nonconformity, education, charities for the poor, not quite my thing. But, you know, if you're interested in the 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th century history, this is absolutely your bag. And if you've got one, you know, it's available online. It's an absolutely must-have source. So we're going to start with Balsham again in 1617, and I want to look at manorial centers. So now the oldest boundaries in a landscape tend to be those that are curving and continuous. So if you have a look at this map, I hope you can see that this area here has got a continuous curvilinear line around it. See if that works. There we go. Here, this is called the church, the manor. Whoops, manor down here. All of this area is the manor. Up here is the church. And all of this land appears to belong to the church because this is called Church Meadow and this is vicarage. I can't remember the name for that. So the manorial centre down here and the church. So you wonder why then this whole thing could be an early manor. And the reason is that most, I'm going out on a limb here, very many, how about that? Very many churches started out as the chapel belonging to a manorial centre. And it was only in the early 13th century when the Pope required that all churches should have their own vicar, that many churches then became independent of, or at least the congregation became, the building became independent of the manor. So here at Balsham, I think that one can say that the manor belonged to, that the whole of this was originally the manor. And then here it was subdivided between the manor and the church. And you can tell it was subdivided because that and this end at right angles on that boundary. And you can also suggest that the whole was originally one unit, because look, see these boundaries here, they all end on that one too. And so this is what my students used to call Sue's T-junction rule, that where one boundary butts up against another one like this, the one across the top is older than the one that butts up against it. The reason is if this one, that one wasn't there, then this one would go on up, because otherwise it would just end in thin air. So you can test this, you know, you could take away, see if I can find my cursor here, you could delete that one, say, no, delete this one first, then that one, then that one. So, you know, you can do this and you can deconstruct these boundaries until all that you're left with is that curvilinear enclosure. And again, Peter Warner has shown that these enclosures tend to be early medieval, perhaps 8th century onwards. So here's another one. This one's a bit later. I'm not sure how old this one is, definitely 10th century, possibly earlier. This is the Berrystead in Wilburton in the Fens. It's got a very fancy Elizabethan house, you can see down the bottom there. And the reason I don't think this is quite so early is because it's not curvilinear. It is a continuous block, but it's got some quite angled corners, hasn't it? So I do think that is it. And there is some additional evidence. So it's called Berrystead, and B-U-R-Y, or as in this case, B-E-R-E, is a name which doesn't uniformly indicate a manorial centre, but very often does. And here, clearly, it's associated with what is known to be a manor, so I think it's a bit of good evidence there. And once more, you can do the deconstructive analysis of take out that boundary, then take out this boundary, take out that one. And by the time you've done that with all the boundaries in that unit, you'd be left with a single whole thing which has been subdivided subsequently over time, but not with a church, which we'll come back to. Planned settlements. So now, the planned villages, not all nucleations are planned, but very many of them are. And this book by Brian Roberts is a really interesting book. The thing about him, he's a very, very clever man, and he doesn't really explain his diagrams. So he expects you to do the work and to go in there and explain the diagrams yourselves. And you know, it can feel like hard work. You don't have to read the whole book from beginning to end all at once. You could just do a little bit, but do that bit and do the work for yourself on that map, and you'll find it, you know, really instructive. So there are rules about finding planned settlement, and they're very easy. They go like this. So 3 things. You need a shared front boundary. So here, look, see, a shared front boundary there and there, and a shared back boundary. There it is along the back, very often called back lane, as this one is. And this one's got a shared back boundary. Here they go onto the river. So those are the first 2. And then the third criterion is that the properties should be of more or less the same area, which on a map you can measure as widths, but really you need to find their acreage. So they all should have to share the same area. So that shows that it's planned, because these things don't happen by accident. One person builds a house next to another person's house in open country 30 years after the first one is built. There's no reason why he should share the same boundaries or have a property of the same area. So let's see how you can find that in the landscape. So we're going back to Balsham here. So in Balsham, we're looking here for a common front boundary, a common back boundary, and properties of more or less equivalent widths. So there are 2. So normally I'd ask you, can you see them? But I'm going to tell you now because we're short of time. So the first one is on the left here. So it's got a common front boundary and a common back boundary. But you see here, that bit there, that's quite irregular. Although it sort of shares the front and back boundary, it's so rounded and it's all subdivided. You know, this is not, this isn't something that is an absolute truth. And so if you're going to go out on a limb with something like that, play it safe. Don't take in stuff that you're going to have difficulty defending. So I would take in this right-hand boundary. I'd start it there and go this way. And then similarly at the back end of this, there are problems here as well. And I'll show you here. I'd stop at this point. And the reason is you can see this little one here interrupts that boundary there, interrupts the back boundary. So, I mean, it might have been part of the planned village. I don't know whether it was or not, obviously. But if you can't defend it easily, don't include it, is the basic rule. So there's one block there, and then there's another block on the right. And so similarly, I'd start with this boundary here, but not that one, because look, it's all triangular. And then moving left, common front boundary, common back boundary, and then stop here, because that little bit on the end looks like a little later addition. I mean, I'm not telling you it wasn't. I'm just saying I don't think I could defend it easily. So I'd rather not make things difficult for myself. So it looks like that. Now there's another game you can play, which is really a lot of fun. And that is you can then count up how many of these things you can see inside. So let's count. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Hurrah. And then you can do the same thing over there and it comes out again. I mean, again, I do it with my students and we usually find something like between 11 and 13 of these plots. And similarly over here, when you look at Doomsday Book, you can only allowed to look at Doomsday Book after you've done this. You can't look at Doomsday Book before, because then you might get the answer you want. You have to look first and then look at Doomsday Book. But look at this, 12 villains in 1086 and 12 smallholders. So, I mean, once again, I can't promise you that this is the case, but it looks very like. And it does mean that I think that you can apportion an approximate date to this, because between 1086 and 1290, the villain population of Balsham went through the roof. I mean, it trebled. So if the number is going to be 12, then one would assume a date that was closer to 1086 than not, perhaps between the point at which the abbey was given the estate in the earlier 10th, 11th century and Doomsday, but I don't know. But anyway, so it means you can play these games and you can start saying something quite reasonable about the origins of your village, as long as you remember that this is a best fit hypothesis. Here's another example. There are many places in Cambridgeshire where there was no manorial lord before 1086, and this is one of them. This is Barrington. And before then, there were 24 freemen, and they all had holdings of quite largely different areas, from quite small to quite big. So there's no way they'd have been living in a planned settlement, and I don't know where they lived. After the Norman conquest, one of those smallholders, one of William's smallholders, came along, and he made a little manor, and he made himself a manor house. And here it is in a, pretty rectangular, because of course the Normans all in straight lines. What can I say? So, but he then downgraded the freemen. By 1086, there are 20 villages. So what happened to the other two? I don't know. But there were 20, and look, they're there. And there are 20 of these plots, and each one of them measures exactly 1 acre. This is a planned villain settlement. And then the smallholders down here, 7 of them, it subdivides appropriately. And they also had precisely similar acreages. The cottages, I don't know where they lived. I think they didn't live in a planned way. I think they were just hither and yon. So you can do this. It's not difficult to do. It's a lot of fun to do, but you do have to be rigorous about only looking at Doomsday afterwards. Sometimes when you look at these, and actually Balsham was an example of this, it looks as though these settlements are laid out over open fields furlongs. The open field strips had a very predictable backwards S or a C curve, as you can see here, like this line there, this line here, and these ones going up along there. So here it looks as though this was open field land onto which a village was settled. And so it was planned in the sense that they were all apportioned the same amount of land in a planned settlement, but the underlying plan was earlier. It was field land. Then we come to the church. Now, the church has always got a lot to say, hasn't it, about when a village was wealthy, when it was poor, when the church was established, and so on. Richard Morris's Churches in the Landscape is just the most brilliant book for looking at churches. So please have a look at that. And if you're interested in the architecture, then the corpus of Romanesque sculpture is online and you can have a look at it. Not all counties have been done, but many of them have. So now the church and the manor are supposed always to have been close together. And actually, this is from Morris's book. You can see that most modern churches have a very close relationship with the manor. And a nice early example is the church at Earls Barton in Northamptonshire with the stunning late Anglo-Saxon stripwork on it. That church stands here at the top of a very tall mound. And here's the mound. You can see it looking in it from this direction. Excuse me, it's called Berry Mount, very nicely. And there's the churchyard wall right along the top. And the whole thing has got a kind of moat around it. And you can extrapolate a further line there, which looks very like one of those curvilinear boundaries. Earls Barton is otherwise quite difficult to interpret, so I'm not going to go any further than saying this is very suggestive. So here the church and the manor appear to be in close conjunction with each other. Here at Wilburton, the church and the manor are not. So here's the church over here, and it's set in the middle of the entranceway to a large area of pasture, which has now disappeared. And that suggests to me that the church was only added later, after the planned settlement with the villeins, the 4 freemen, and here's the manor house. All of that was in place before the church was founded, so that when the church was founded, they had to find some free space for it, and the only bit was in the middle of an area of common. It was quite unlike Earls Barton, where the church and the manor are so close to each other. And Great Everston, they're even further apart. So here's the church down at the bottom. There's the manor up there. This was another one of those manors where there was no medieval manors, where there's no manor at Doomsday. Sorry, there's no manor at the Conquest. The manor is only established after the Conquest. And so once more, I think that the person laid out a planned settlement for his villeins, and then later on wanted a fancy manor house with a moat. And the only way he could fill a moat was by putting it at the other end of the village where there was a stream that he could use to fill his moat with. So the church and the man are not always close to each other. Then there's architecture. The Royal Commission volumes are excellent on this, and particularly the Cambridgeshire one, if you don't mind my saying, because it has this really marvelous map showing the evolution of house plans from medieval right the way up into the 19th century, so that you can use the data in the volume to date buildings from the outside. It's not an invariably good source, and there are other ways of checking it, more detailed ways, but it's not a bad place to start. And once you do that, you can play some really lovely games. So this is mapping where how settlement moves around the landscape. Here's our 12th century church, but you can see the settlement in Toft is quite in a different place. So why did that happen? Was the settlement originally around the church? So Carenza Lewis did some of her wonderful test fitting work, and you can see that here, late the pre-conquest settlement seems to have been down by the river, nowhere near the church, which of course we don't know if there was an earlier church, but it wasn't there by then. And by the time you get into the Middle Ages, they're already beginning to move from the original site up along to the current site of the village. That continues in the 17th and 18th centuries, and is confirmed in the 19th, except that in the 19th, the parson builds himself a posh house over here and some cottages over there. So one gets a little cluster of 19th century buildings around the church. But fundamentally, the village has been around here probably since about 1000. And I've no idea why the church is at a distance from it. But these are great games you can play, and you can find out an awful lot about your settlement from using this kind of material. And then there are greens. Oliver Rackham's book on the history of the countryside is absolutely wonderful for this. So I shan't say any more about that. I expect you've all read it. This is another one of Brian Roberts' excellent diagrams, and he shows really it's a way of looking at property rights. So there's private property, which is self-explanatory, the manor, the houses, the enclosures around them. There's public property, which are largely speaking rights of way. And then there's communal property, things that are shared within the village, but that are not public to people from outside the village. And those are carry on them quite distinctive buildings. And it's that I want to carry forward into the next few minutes. So here we are in Great Eversden again. Here's the church. How can we find a green? Well, one of the criteria for identifying a green is that it's the focus for rights of way, footpaths, and hurrah, there they are. But of course, you have to remember my feathers. It's not an immutable rule, as I could be wrong. So what about communal buildings? So here are all the communal buildings. The church, obviously a communal building. The pound, the Guildhall, the smithy, and the pub. And then although they're 19th century, this is a nonconformist school and an independent chapel. And in this part of the country where one has parliamentary enclosure in the later 18th and the 19th centuries, it's very common to find these communal buildings placed on earlier areas of verge next to roads, which has been enclosed and then allotted. I don't know why that is. I just wonder whether people had a kind of slightly guilty conscience that communal land was being privatized, and so they built communal buildings on those areas. But you can see how nicely clustered that is around the church with another one here. You look at the line of that road. I'm going to show you the geology now. Oh, sorry, no, I'm not going to show you. I'll show you geology in a minute. And just to say, whoops, do that again. Just to say that I think that the current road has been diverted around the church, because if you look at the alignment of the high street there, it does the dogleg around the church, but actually it's picked up again down here. And so one can assume that the churchyard at some point has been enlarged, and in that process has pushed the main street further to the north. And then the geology map once more explains it. So here's the church, here's the main street. This is galt clay, which is extremely wet. You can't use it for anything except pasture. And this here is chalk. And along the boundary between the chalk and the galt clay is where the springs come out, because the water goes down through the chalk, and then when it gets to the galt clay, it can't be absorbed by the galt because the galt's already wet. So it comes out as springs. And the ground here then is very flat. And so the springs come out, they're not running very fast down to the nearest river. And so they tend to make the ground pretty boggy. And it's the last land in any parish to become arable, mostly after enclosure. And so here you can see why this is, the church is there. Oh, there's the church, sorry, the church is on that gold clay. You can see the communal buildings around the church. They were up here. And I suspect that at one point, perhaps in the late 11th century, all of this was a large area of common pasture, which has gradually been built on and then colonized. So once more, the geology and it's just crucial to understanding that. Here's another example. Here's Kingston. Whoops. A planned green here. You can tell it's planned because it's rectangular. It's got rectangular, no green ends up like that by accident. But down at the bottom, there's an area called Kingston Green. Sorry, there's a church and the manor house up there. I should have said. Here's the green. There's another area down the bottom called Kingston Green. And if you look at it, it sits at the center of a nice little rectangle. And all of that was originally open. And these are encroachments on what had previously been open ground. It's a marketplace with a very posh late medieval house on it from a market that was established in 1306. And you can see when the guy got the market grant that he diverted the roads around the market in order to make them go through. So if you were traveling from there to there, you weren't allowed to bypass market. You had to go through the market to go there. And similarly, this one, you just couldn't go by the side. You had to go into the market and then out again in order to travel through. So these are just small techniques, but they tell you so much about the history of small sections of a landscape. And then this is Comberton, where once again, you can see the communal buildings. There's the school, a smithy, or garage east now, what used to be a maltings. You see the parish sign, the gritting box, the bass shelter, the benches here for people to sit on, the duck pond, lots of communal structures, and the sign there that says Green End, but no sign of a green. I'm going to show you the green. So if you look here, here we were looking here, there's the duck pond and the school and the garage. There's a continuous boundary running up there, up the side of the modern road, which is a verge that's been enclosed. And you can see bits of evidence as you go along. So the maltings there, now there's a smithy, now a garage. This used to be the maltings, you can see the malt, but now it's also all the garage. And it's built right on the edge of a very narrow piece of ground. And it's built in clay lump, which is a typically early 19th century structure. But anyway, communal buildings. And then up here, there was there's a pub. Whoops, why does it do that? The pub over here. And then just past the pub, that boundary there, when you look at it, you go up the little lane here. Look, there's a sharp definition there, exactly where that line crosses the road between 19th century brick and what used to be a clay lump wall before it all fell down, and some of which I have in my garage. But I only picked up the bits that had fallen. And then in the house just next door, there's quite a pronounced ridge here running across, which is the old edge of what used to be the edge of a green. And you can see that same break here between one wall and another further up, a little dink in the wall there. You can see a little dink in the wall, and so on. And then, so I've cut in all the communal buildings. And then on the other side here, there's a guild hall, another communal building. Whoops. And a really substantial ditch here along that side. And I think I've rather curtailed the explanation, but I do think all of this used to be a green. And they're the sources that you can use. And then just briefly, there are sources on deserted settlements that you can use. And there are lots of books on place names and field names. These are some of my favorites, and also an online resource at Nottingham. There are archaeological resources online that you can look for your own parish. There's lots of other stuff you can be reading. Really, the more you read, the better. And then just briefly, be critical. When you read your source, don't believe everything you read, and see if there are things you can do in your own place. Be brave. Remember that a cat can look at a king. Don't think that you're not experienced enough to do these things. Be brave, go on. You know, it's got to be easier than going to the dentist. Find as much evidence as you possibly can and follow it, but remember, each little bit adds to the next, and it doesn't necessarily make it true. And then remember that Rome wasn't built in a day. It all takes time. Thank you. Good.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was absolutely wonderful. I hope you're, don't forget we'll be recording this and making it available online afterwards. So if you haven't been able to keep up with the enormous and enormous varied and excellent selection of secondary reading you can engage with, don't worry, we'll be making a note of that afterwards. So with that in mind, Angus Winchester has actually sent us a handout, which I'll make sure is forwarded to you all after we're done. But now to move on to Angus. Come on, unmute. There we go. Right. Angus Winchester is Professor Emeritus at the University of Lancaster. He started his career with the VCH in Shropshire, which will be part of which will be one of the case studies he's talking about today. And while at Lancaster, developed interests in landscape and environmental history in particular. And among his achievements there, probably among the lesser of the achievements really, was reviving the VCH in the former counties of Cumberland and Westmoreland in VCH terms, now the county of Cumbria. The Cumbria County History Trust is legacy in VCH terms, and that has produced, among other things, a gazetteer of townships and a gazetteer of Cumberland townships with sort of basic levels of detail for every township in the county. And so far, one VCH short, which is on Renwick and Kirkoswald. So I'm going to be talking about sort of upland communities and colonisation, and I'll just pass him over to you now.
Thank you very much, Adam. Welcome, everyone. It's very nice to be here. I think place is important to all of us, so perhaps I should just say where I'm speaking from. I'm on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales in a place called Chapel the Dale, and it's actually not raining, which is unusual for this part of the world. Now, what I'm going to do this afternoon, I hope will tie in rather nicely with Sue's excellent introduction to settlement study. I want to focus, first of all, on a particular period, the period of medieval colonization, which actually leads to quite a large proportion of the rural settlement in England that we encounter today. But I also want to concentrate on the use of documentary sources. I think there's partly, again, as Adam has said, I began my career with VCH. That's a sort of VCH approach, is to perhaps concentrate on the documentary. So I'm talking really here about the great sweep of medieval colonization, which took place across Europe in the 4 centuries, from roughly 900 AD to roughly 1300 or so AD. And I want to look at 2 particular areas, one of which, as Adam says, is part of Shropshire, and the other is in the uplands of Cumbria, which sort of give a quite nice contrast. And of course, both concerned with this particular period of colonization. Let me see if I can share the screen successfully. And I think that's the right one.
Yeah, that's working.
It's working, and I'll just move to the slideshow. Right. Yes, I want to begin. I think the sort of starting point is perhaps to just think about a very simple pair of concepts, which I think will run through what I'm saying, which are the concepts of core and periphery. And in terms of what we're talking about this afternoon, the contrast is between old settled cores, areas which have been settled, trotted out for my purposes, well before the Norman conquest. And secondly, the peripheral areas, which are the areas of colonization on the edges, by and large, of the old settled areas, often in wooded areas or on the margins of wastes. And the wastes would be both the hills in the uplands and the moors, but also in lowland areas on the wetlands. I think the useful thing about the concept of core and periphery is that you can think of it at different levels, because of different scales, I should say, because I think you can think of it in terms of, let's call it county or sub-county level. In other words, you could have a lot of parishes, and here just for these two orange areas represent two parishes, so that could cover quite a lot of parishes, some of which would lie within an area that was principally of old settlement, of core settlement, others of which would lie in areas in the periphery of colonization. So you can think about it at the larger scale, and I'll look at that in a second. But you can also think of the core and periphery at parish level. So if you think of the whole parish as a single unit, and within a lot of parishes, you can see a core of early settlement and a periphery of later colonization. And it's really those themes that I want to play with. Our starting point, if we think about it at county level, is again to use some maps created by Brian Roberts, who was my doctoral supervisor years and years ago. And these are some maps that Brian published in his first book on rural settlement in Britain back in 1978 of his home county of Warwickshire. The concentration here is on these maps is first on place names and secondly on the Doomsday evidence. If we take the names of places across Warwickshire as a whole, what Brian has mapped there are names that end or contain the Old English terms ham and tun, which essentially mean a settlement, a village, a farmstead, on the one hand, and those are the dots, the black dots. And on the other, place names which contain the Old English element lear, which comes through as a lee usually, which means a wood or a glade or a clearing, and those are the little crosses. And what's striking about Warwickshire is that there is a very clear pattern, as you can see. Most of the south and east of the county has a concentration of dots, in other words, of the tun place names, whereas this stretch across the north and the west of the county has a concentration of lear woodland names. And what we're seeing in Warwickshire is, in effect, if you like, a core of earlier settlement on the south and east of the county, and a frontier of colonization in the north and the west. And when you compare that map with the Doomsday evidence, a very striking correlation appears. The left-hand map here, drawn from the Doomsday evidence, is of the number of plough teams in each settlement, or in each estate, I should say. And you can see how those are, well, certainly both more plough teams and larger numbers of plough teams across the south and east of the county, where those tun names were. A few up in the northwest here, but across that strip where there were most of the woodland names, far fewer plough teams. Conversely, the right-hand map is a map showing the woodland recorded in Doomsday Book. And again, the majority of the woodland, as you might expect, is where there are the woodland place names. So it's a very clear and striking pattern at county level between, if you like, a core of early settlement in the on the southeastern side of the county and a zone of colonization on the northwest. Warwickshire was famous for being divided, in fact, into two very different landscapes, the Feldon, as it was called, the area of open field villages in the south and east of the county, and the Arden, the more wooded area of the north and the west. And this pattern, this distinction at this sort of level between cores and peripheries is found elsewhere across lowland England. I'm thinking, for example, of the Kent and Sussex Weald in the background. It's an area of colonization with the older settlement around the edge, and of Harold Fox's important work on the people of the wolds, the idea that the wolds, the more hilly areas, have a very different landscape history from the old settled areas in the valleys. So to zoom down, to sort of focus down a bit at a rather more local level, I want to begin with a couple of examples from Shropshire. And the first of these is again simply looking at place names, and looking at place names in the middle area of Shropshire. Remember Middle, the famous settlement where Richard Gough wrote his History of Middle around about 1700. This wonderful, if you don't know it, this wonderful sort of scurrilous in parts story of all the inhabitants of Middle. It's a village northwest of Shrewsbury. And looking again at the place names, again, that contrast that I've just been talking about shows up, but at a rather more local level. The black squares here are places ending with the Old English tun, ton. The X's are places ending in lee. And there's a very striking pair of names, both places called Stanwardine, and this one up here is Stanwardine in the wood. This one down here is Stanwardine in the fields. And we seem to have this sort of contrast between an area of older settlement in the fields down here and a strip, I would suggest, between these two red dotted lines where there seems to have been more late surviving woodland, as well as the lee names. There are a number of names like the wood, common wood, Hurst names, and so on. Cockshut, which is the name referring to the place where woodcock are found. A strip of late surviving woodland, which notice also tends to coincide with the boundaries of the parishes. These are the dotted lines here are the parish boundaries, and you can see how a lot of parish boundaries converge within this woodland zone. The suggestion being that you have a strip of woodland which has then been divided up between the parishes. Again, probably in this critical period that I'm talking about, late Anglo-Saxon, Norman through to the 13th century. The area that I want to concentrate a bit more on is the Telford area of Shropshire to the east of the county, where you've got a very similar pattern. I'm using Telford because this was the parish, the area we were working on when I was working for the Victoria County History in Shropshire back in the late 70s, early 80s. And you'll find the materials I'm talking about here in Shropshire volume 11. The area we were looking at coincides quite closely with the new town of Telford, for the very obvious reason that Telford New Town helped to fund the volume. So we're talking about a block of land, looking at the relief map on the right-hand side here. It stretches from the River Severn down here in the Severn Gorge at Ironbridge, up over the ridge which peaks in the Wrekin, this hill here, and stretching down to the north towards the Weald Moors, inland lowlands wetland area to the north there. The town of Wellington is about here, and I say Ironbridge and Corbett Vale are down here. When you do a similar sort of analysis of place names, and indeed in this case also putting on the places where there is recorded woodland on early maps and documentary evidence, for example, a clear striking pattern emerges. The ton names here are the white squares, and you can see that the majority of them are found along the north. There's a couple here in the middle, but most of them are in a strip along the lower land to the north of the Wrekin down towards the Weald Moors. Whereas the bulk of the southern part of the area has, well, first of all, a lot of surviving woodland, the shaded areas, but also these triangles, lee names. Again, this contrast between, if you like, an older core of settlement down on the lowland area and this backdrop of woodland pasture area, which was within the Royal Forest of Mount Gilbert until the early 14th century, up on the hills. One of the things we tried to do in the VCH volume was to reconstruct the landscape as it might have been in the 14th century. This, I think, was something of a first for VCH. I can claim some credit for it, I think, where we tried to sort of portray this cartographically. And the patterns, you can see, these shaded areas here are areas where there's recorded open fields. These obviously is the woodland or the little dots. And you can see how the majority of the open field coincides with the tun names in here. It shades off into the wetlands, the marshlands here on the edge of the Weald Moors. When you get up onto the wooded belt, much less in the way of open field land, much more surviving woodland. And what I want to do is to concentrate on two parishes, the parish of Dawley, which is this area in here, and the adjacent and very small parish of Sturchley, and to ask what we can say about the history of settlement in those areas, both lee names, both woodland clearing names. What can we actually say about the development of the settlement pattern? If we begin with Dawley, Dawley, as I'm sure you will remember, was the name originally given to what is now Telford New Town. It was going to be Dawley New Town when it was founded. And that says something, which is that it's a landscape which has been completely transformed by the new town. So you've got to sort of sweep away the landscape of the new town first of all. But if you want to get back to the medieval settlement pattern, you also have to sweep away the really very extensive post-medieval industrial settlement, because here we are in the middle of the East Shropshire coalfield, an area dominated by coal and by ironworks. And Dawley is bang in the middle of that industrial area. This is the map of the parish as it was in the 19th century. It consisted of 3 townships, Little Dawley in the bottom here in the south, which slopes down into 2 quite steep dingles, as they call them in Shropshire, running down to Coalbrookdale down here. Great Dawley in the middle, with an early focus here, which I'll say a bit more about in a second, and rising ground up to an area of heathland up here on the parish boundary. And then Mallinslee, this northern township here, which again is more or less on a plateau rising up to the northwest. All 3 are Lee names. In the case where you've got a pairing of names like Great Dawley and Little Dawley, that sort of suggests, doesn't it, that originally that was probably one area called Dawley, which has been divided into 2, and we'll see there is a hint of that in a second. In terms of the industrial settlement, the dotted line running through the middle of the map is actually the geological fault, which determines the history of Dawley in a very major way from an industrial point of view. It's called the Lightmoor Fault. And basically, it threw down the coal seams lower down on the right and further up nearer the surface on the left. With the result, there's a lot of very shallow and very early mining in all this area, this stippled area here, which is basically waste tips from the early modern period. Whereas down on the right here, it had to wait until the technology of the 19th century for deep shaft mining. So there's rather less in the way of this sprawl of destructive mining landscape here. Whereas in Little Dawley, which is sloping downhill anyway, there's more of that spoil and so on in this area. What the industrial period did in the parish of Dawley was to obviously draw a population in. And what happened from the 16th century through to the 19th was essentially the building of numerous cottages on roadside wastes, in fields, on common land, all over the parish. All the scattered little dots on that map are cottages that were built mostly in that period. The early core of settlement, which is here that I've arrowed, and here there's a blown up version of it from the first edition 6-inch map. And you can see there's just really a little small loop of lanes around here. There's the church there. The manor house was here, but it's now gone, disappeared in the 19th century under the castle ironworks. Dawley Castle was the manor house. This seems to be the core of the medieval settlement, not that there's very much there. It's all surrounded by spoil tips, as you can see. And what happened from the 16th century onwards was that the center of gravity of the settlement shifted. So that what became, by the 19th century, the town center of the town of Dawley was this area here, at Dawley Green, on the T-junction between 2 roads here, where the cottage settlement became so intense that it actually turned into a town. And you can see that there's a more or less continuous cottage settlement, running up these roads here and along the roads here. So if we want to go back to the medieval period, we have to say, try to sweep away all that that cottage settlement and try to get to what might have been there in the Middle Ages. Little Dawley is perhaps a place to look at because we have for Little Dawley a rather good estate plan from the 1770s, which at least takes the landscape back before the worst of the 19th century industrial damage. And in Little Dawley in the 1770s, you've got a small village, hamlet, not sure whether you call it a village or a hamlet, but a small cluster of houses here, and a scatter of cottages across the rest of the township. That small cluster at Little Dawley is associated with possibility of a medieval chapel. There are sort of references to a chapel, but it doesn't survive. and to these, these three areas of surviving open field, which abut on similar areas of surviving open field just over here in Great Dorley, suggesting, I think, that there might have been a core of open field land here at Dorley, which is then divided between Great Dorley and Little Dorley. One thing that I should have said about Dorley, and it's true of the next place I'm going to come on to in a second, Sturchley, was that what we're talking about in these areas of late colonization are often very small settlements and also subsidiary settlements. In the case of both the northern and southern townships in Dorley Parish, Mallingsley and Little Dorley, they were both settlements within another manor, the manor of Ligummery. They were dependencies of another manor in the Middle Ages. Again, a sort of indication of this secondary nature, this frontier nature of these communities. And what the landscape suggests here at Little Dorley is, as I said, that there is this small focus of open field land around a very small village here, but that even in the later 18th century, quite a lot of woodland survives. That's shown by the little tree symbols. And from the field names in the township, it appears that a lot more woodland would have survived at an earlier date. Fields named Stocking or Ridding or Rudding, all of these refer to clearance of woodland. And when you start plotting those field names, which are the dotted areas on that map, you can see how basically most of the western side of the township was probably wooded until comparatively recently. So what you have here is a small cluster of farms with a very limited area of open field land around it, and a large area of woodland and wood pasture forming most of the territory of the township. If we jump across the parish boundary to the neighbouring little parish of Sturchley, here is Sturchley as it was around about 1885. There's not much in Sturchley. There's a church, which on the face of it appears to be an 18th century brick church. There are a few houses, and there is a hall, Sturchley Hall. Again, when you look at the early Ordnance Survey map, that really is the settlement at Sturchley. Not a lot, as you can see. Sturchley Hall Farm, that little strip, that little row of buildings that we saw in the previous photograph with the church behind them, and that's it. That settlement, though, probably, well, almost certainly indicates the place where the settlement of Sturchley was from really quite early in the Middle Ages. Because although St James's Church is, as I say, apparently a brick-clad building, behind that brick is a stone medieval church. And within the stone medieval church is this wonderful Norman arch, suggesting that the church has been there probably from the 12th century, if not before. Sturchley Hall Farm is a sort of 16th century quite grand farm. And so there are, I think, quite good grounds for thinking that that is the original core of the settlement. If you look at the parish as a whole, here is the Sturchley area we've just been talking about down here. Apart from that, there is a farm called Grange Farm there, a farm called Brands, and a farm called Holmere. We can forget about Mount Pleasant, it's a recent thing, and there are the furnaces over here. And really, there are just those three other farms, and that's it. And if you look at the history of the evidence, the documentary evidence for the town, for the parish of Sturchley, it was granted to Buildwas Abbey in the 1240s. When there was an account of Buildwas Abbey's property, and at one stage in 1284, the estate is described as the vills of Sturchley and Oulmere. Well, Oulmere comes to us today as Holmer down here, suggesting that that was also a medieval settlement. Vill, it's not quite clear what they mean by vill, but possibly more than just a single farm. The other farm, Grange Farm, is apparently a monastic grange created by Buildwas Abbey, probably soon after they acquired it. So it looks as though they probably went in and probably cleared woodland and took a big chunk of the northern part of the parish as their own. And we know that Brand's farm, the other settlement over here, the other farm over here, was carved out of Grange Farm in the mid 17th century. So we're dealing with a really very small community, and again with colonization into a woodland area, in this case rather more dramatic colonization than at Little Dorley. But in both cases, it's very small areas of settlement, a lot of surviving woodland, and colonization of parts of that woodland in the 13th century. Now I'd like to change to a very different type of environment and move up to look at one particular valley in Cumberland, somewhere I know rather well and have worked on for a long, long time. So again, I'm going back to some very early work in my career. It's the valley that runs down from Buttermere down towards Cockermouth. Keswick is on the right-hand side there, if those of you who know the Lake District. It's basically the valley that contains the lakes of Buttermere, Crummock and Loweswater, this valley down here. And the two settlements I want to concentrate on in this case study are Lawton down here and Buttermere itself up here. And again, I think it's useful to think in terms of cores and peripheries. The red circles here outline the areas for which we have really quite good evidence of settlement, certainly by the late 12th century, with, well, in the case of both Lawton and Buttermere, with open fields on the flat valley floor. At Loweswater, probably open fields. I'm not absolutely clear about that. But these three areas seem to be sort of cores of early settlement. Each has a, well, Lawton and Buttermere and Loweswater rather, both have chapels of ease by the 12th century. Buttermere has a mill by the very early 13th century. Lawton has a mill by the middle of the 12th century. Loweswater has a mill, I think, by the end of the, or certainly at some stage it's recorded, I think, in the 13th century. So these appear to be the main sort of foci of agricultural settlement. And between and around them are a number of place names which indicate colonization in these upland areas. The crosses, these ones here, are thwaite names. Names include the element thwaite, which is the old Norse word meaning a clearing, little thwaite, Saxthwaite, Brackenthwaite, and Landthwaite. And you can see how they form a sort of line between the core area of Lawton and the core area of Loweswater on much more broken ground across here. And I think one should add to the thwaite names also a couple of names which include a term borrowed from the Gaelic that is brought over to Cumbria by Scandinavian settlers. It's the term which it appears as usually. It's usually written as ERG. It's from the old Gaelic word airy, meaning a shealing ground. And there's Moser up here and the element of Rannerdale down here, both of which refer to summer grazing grounds. So we seem to have an area of colonization, summer grazing, between these core areas in the most fertile parts of the valley. Well, can we try to put a bit more flesh on those bones from the documentary evidence? If we begin with Lawton, Lawton is a place where the valley widens out fairly considerably, and you've got a series of, which I'll say more about in a minute, of former open fields on the flat valley floor here. And I'm going to be saying a bit about the village of High Lawton, which is this village that runs along here. You've then got a number of scattered hamlets like Scales and Swinside and some others, Highside over here, on the lower slopes of the valley. And then above them, and really above us on the line that I'm marking with a cursor now, everything above that line was open, unenclosed, rough common fell grazings until the 1830s. So it's very typical of an upland settlement. If we look at Lawton, the map there is the field trace from the 19th century. It shows the settlements and it shows the field pattern. And I think what's quite striking here is there are the two villages of Low Lawton down here beside the river and High Lawton that I showed you on the photograph just now there. These are the open unenclosed fells over here. Around them are the little hamlets of Armourside, Gilbrow, Highside, Scales, and Swinside on the lower slopes. And there's a very striking and immediately striking contrast between the thin strip-like fields down here on the flat valley floor around the villages, which in the northwest of England typically represent piecemeal enclosure of open fields, probably in the 16th and 17th centuries, where basically they enclose them in stages, and a few bundles of strips are enclosed at any one time. So the boundaries of the new fields are almost bound to follow the furrows between the ridges in the open field. So you get the shape of the open field preserved in the new enclosures. So you've got these strip-like fields around the two villages. And up on the edges of the slope of the fells, you've got these much more irregular field patterns around the hamlets. If we then try and look at Lawton, if you like, in terms of its land tenure, try and dissect it in terms of its land tenure, Lawton was a township within the free chase or the private forest of Derwent Fells, which belonged to the Lords of the Honour of Cockermouth. They didn't retain it all. In fact, we have a very detailed survey of that estate in 1578. And all that they had in Lawton at that time was a few farms in Low Lawton, 3 tenements in Low Lawton. They had directly as tenants of the estate the hamlet of Armourside with its 4 farms. They had the hamlet of Swinside with its 3 farms, and they had a couple of farms at Scales here. But there were also in Lawton a number of freeholds. There was a freehold of the Dean and Chapter of Carlisle, which in effect was the village of High Lawton, which I'll say more about in a second. And then there were 3 people who had, well, in 2 cases, a third of the Vill of Low Lawton, and in 1 case, a 6th of the Vill of Low Lawton. So most of Low Lawton is freehold. And then there were other freeholders who had Highside and Gilbrow. Now, I'll try and put together the medieval settlement history in a second, but let's just first of all look at High Lawton. Just remember, High Lawton is the village that belonged to the Dean and Chapter of Carlisle. It was actually granted to the Priory of Carlisle in the 12th century. And we have, because it was Dean and Chapter property, there was a parliamentary survey in 1649, and it's one of those wonderful parliamentary surveys, as if you ever used them, which include details of the abuttals of each property. So you can actually reconstruct the landscape of the village from the abuttals that are given. So-and-so's property lies between the property of Henry Bloggs on one side and Joe Smith on the other side, and so on. And this is my attempt to do that on the right-hand side here from the 1649 survey. Here is the village as it was in 1863 from the first edition Ordnance Survey. Going back to Sue's talk, there are elements there, aren't there, of a planned village. It appears to be a group of properties, very similar size plots running back. There's something missing there. Bounded with a common property boundary along the lane here, between 2 lanes running up to the common here and here. It has a hint of having been planned. This farm in the middle is known appropriately as Mid-Town, in the middle of the village, middle of the town. And it's that one there. We know it's that farm. You can trace it through its deeds, but also it belongs to the Wilkinson family, and they have a nice date stone on the back of the 17th century farm that's there. What the survey confirms really is that the village must have looked something similar to what it does in the 19th century in the 17th century. Each of these blocks is described as a tenement, a farm. And behind number 6 here, there are a group of cottages. And even here in the 19th century, behind the main row of buildings here is this little enclave where there was the smithy and the pub. So they are apparently those cottages, or the successors of those cottages that are there in the 17th century. And this actually throws in or brings in another point that is worth making, I think, about settlement history generally, which is that if you were to go to Lawton today, there's been a lot of change. It was a village which had a small sort of mini industrial episode in the 19th century, so a lot of the farms all went out of the village, excuse me, and the village tended to become full of cottages of industrial workers. And most of the fabric of the village is what, 17th, 18th century. Midtown is one of the older buildings in the village. And as in most rural settlements, it's worth, I think, distinguishing between the fabric of a present of a village and the position and line of things in the settlement. And in this case, what the 1649 survey suggests is that the basic lines of things, where the different elements of the village were, demonstrates continuity through to the 19th century, even if the fabric has changed. And looking back in time, we don't have any details, but it's very likely that going back into the medieval period, the basic framework of the village would have remained something similar. And particularly if it is a planned village, perhaps it was planned at the time, as we'll see in a second, when the Priory of Carlisle was granted High Lawton. If we try to put the story together now, here's the field trace on the left. The right-hand map is a sort of interpretive map. I attempt to try to say something about the development of settlement in this particular township in the Middle Ages. Well, let's begin with the villages of Lawton, because we've got two villages, High and Low Lawton. And just as we had with Great and Little Dorley, when you've got one place name divided into a high and low, big, great and small, west and east, whatever it is, the suggestion is that this might have been one single unit. And there are just a couple of hints that this might have been the case here. This lane that runs right the way through the middle of the township, this one down here, is the boundary between the land belonging to High Lawton here and the land belonging to Low Lawton here. The only building on that lane until the late 19th century was the church, which was a parochial chapel and can be traced back to the 12th century. As well, it's a reference to a chapel in the 12th century. The building itself is early 19th century. We know that this block of land, the land of High Lawton, is what was granted to Priory of Carlisle in 1133, well, between 1122 and 1133, we think. And it looks very likely that the village, a unit of called Lawton, has been divided in two at that point. The part becoming the property of the Priory of Carlisle becoming High Lawton, and possibly with a planned village, as we've seen. The part becoming Low Lawton, this side here, being, well, certainly a freehold by 1230, a freehold which we then discover from tracing it through on the Inquisition's post-mortem, which is the way that it's possible to trace these estates through the later medieval period. It looks as though the freehold gets divided into 3/3. One of those thirds gets divided into 2/6. One of those sixths escheats back to the superior lord, which is why the superior lordship has 3 properties in Low Lawton in the 16th century. The rest of it is all freehold. So that looks as though that's a unit. And in terms of settlement and land use, the open field core here, if that was an earlier core, gets divided down Crossgate Lone between the two villages. Just before leaving it, Crossgate Lone, that's the name. Gate simply means street in the north usually. And cross, could it be that it was referring to a cross, a preaching cross from before the church? There's a possibility. But it certainly looks like an old feature in the landscape, coming back to Sue's T-junction analysis. It runs right the way through with a lot of field boundaries butting up against it. And it's, as we've seen, the boundary between the two estates, which go back to the 12th century. So I think we can think of Lawton as an early core, which then gets possibly divided into 2 in the 12th century. Around it, on the slopes of the lower slopes of the fells, we have, I think, this is the zone of colonization, probably colonized between, well, in the 12th and possibly into the early 13th century. As in other parts of the country, some of this may have been taken in the form of grants of land as freeholds at an early date around the edge of earlier settlement. Certainly Highside and Gilbrow are both freeholds, as I've said. Some of it is, in effect, assarting on the edges of the private forest. At Swinside here, these 3 farms here originated as assarts, which are referred to in the survey of 1259 on the edge of the private forested zone fells, and so they remain being held directly from the feudal superior, the Lord of Cockermouth. The area known as scales is perhaps just worth a slight consideration, because the term scales it's the Scandinavian equivalent of the term shield or shielding, which usually is interpreted as referring to some sort of a temporary hut out on a summer pasture. What is striking about scales at Lawton is that it's referred to in the early 16th century as Lawton scales. And when you start looking at the pattern of tenure within it, it looks as though it is held by the same people who hold Low Lawton. So it looks almost as though it's possibly a set of shieldings belonging to Low Lawton, giving them access to grazing on the lower fell slopes, presumably after High Lawton had been granted away. Again, probably representing colonization of a summer pasture at some stage in the 12th or 13th century. Finally, let's move on up the valley to Buttermere. Buttermere is right in the heart of the Lake District, and the township consists really of two parts separated by the Lake of Buttermere. There's the village of Buttermere itself here, which was a small cluster of farms in the 16th century, which shared an open field stretched out here between the two lakes. Again, long, thin, strip-like fields, not unlike those in the Vale of Lawton, representing the piecemeal enclosure of the open field, probably in the 16th and 17th century. Around the edges of the field, there were a number of other farms, which I'll come back to in a minute. But there's one of them showing up white there. There's another one down here in the woods here, and a couple of others as well. And then at the head of the lake was another separate farm called Gatesgarth, which still is one of the big sheep farms in this case, in the heart of the Lake District, a major Herdwick farm. Again, let's go back. Let's just have a look at the map. The previous slide was taken from looking from the hill off to the left there. Here's the village. Here's the farms around the edge, and here's Gatesgarth. Gatesgarth's history is completely separate, really, from that of the rest of Buttermere in the Middle Ages. Gatesgarth was a private pasture of vaccary belonging to the lords of the Honour of Cockermouth. We're lucky. It's one of those wonderful accidents of history. The estate of Cockermouth, the Honour of Cockermouth, was divided in two between two heirs in the 13th century, and Gatesgarth and the other half of the Honour went to the de Fortibus family, the Earls of Albemarle, or Mar, and ended up belonging to the widow of the last Earl, Countess Isabella, who died in 1293. During the period of her widowhood, there survives a lovely series of account rolls for this estate, including detailed accounts from the vaccary at Gatesgarth. And really the only reason they survived was that after her death, the estate escheated to the crown, and presumably a barrel would have been stuffed full of these account rolls, brought down to London. They would have been shoved into the tower and kept. But then in 1323, the crown re-granted the half of the honour of Cockermouth that had belonged to Countess Isabella to the descendants of the other co-parsoner back from the 13th century. So it reunited the honour of Cockermouth. So it reunited the honour, granted them the land, but forgot to return the account rolls. And so those account rolls survive in the National Archives in that wonderful collection of SC6 account rolls. So Gatesgarth is separate. Gatesgarth is a vaccary which is run directly by the estate in the 1270s, 1280s, and then eventually is granted out after Countess Isabella's death. This huge big enclosure instead, running right up into the top of the fells in here called Gatesgarth Side, is apparently the private pasture that went with Gatesgarth, and is, if you like, the last vestige really of the private forest of Derwent Fells. So we can put Gatesgarth to one side. It has a separate history. Let's concentrate on the area of Buttermere and the surrounding farms. In the 16th century, as you can see, there are a cluster of farms in Buttermere village itself. They all share those open fields marked by stipple between the two lakes. But around the edge are Woodhouse, a couple of farms called Sour Scale Bank, Spout House, and Bow de Beck. And in order to, you'll see that on the map, I've been really very precise. Their land is vertically shaded. And I've said fellside farms colonized circa 1215 and between then and 1323. How can one be so precise? Well, the answer, this is my final point really, is by looking at the particular service that was due, a service known as walking silver, which you find in several places in the Lake District, which was a customary payment for taking cloth to the Lord's fulling mill to have it fulled. And in the accounts for Buttermere, you find that actually there are two lots of walking silver. There's 4 shillings and 10pence paid to the reeve of Braithwaite, which is another manor over the hills near Keswick. And then there's a fee, a sum of 2 shillings and 7pence paid to the reeve of Buttermere. What's going on? Well, this brings us back to this partition of the manor of the honour of Cockermouth rather, and the Forest of Doe and Fells in 1215, when the honour was divided, and Buttermere, in other words, the village of Buttermere with the farms and their open fields between the two lakes, were granted to the person who had Braithwaite as their main manor. Whereas the forests adjacent to them, in other words, the hillsides around the village, were granted to the De Fortibus, or the ancestors of the De Fortibus family, the owners of the other half of the forest. So that's why the farms in Buttermere pay their walking silver to Braithwaite, and that continues right through into the 16th, 17th century. Whereas the farms who pay their walking silver to the reeve of Buttermere are these farms around the edges, on the edge of the fells, which presumably represent land that was colonized after the partition and before the two halves of the honour of Cockermouth were put back together again in 1323. So I hope what I've tried to suggest with this, particularly these two case studies from the Lake District, is that one can actually do some quite inventive things if one is lucky enough to have the right documentary evidence that allows one to piece together what's going on and to think in terms of, again, a phrase that I learned from years and years ago from Brian Roberts, proprietary land units. That seems to me to be quite a useful way of thinking about settlement. Think of it in terms of its the rent it pays, who it's held from, and try to use that as a way into thinking about the development of settlement, particularly in these areas of colonization where new farms and new settlements are being established in the great wave of population growth in the 12th and 13th centuries in particular. Thank you.
And thank you, Angus. That was really, really interesting, and a very stimulating discussion of a landscape people are quite keen on looking at, but don't necessarily understand how it works. And certainly I didn't until now. So thank you for that. Are there any questions? I saw one or two coming in the chat, but are there anything anyone else has thought of? Yeah, there's one from John Titterton a couple of minutes ago. John asks, has anyone tried to find a correlation between population growth and settlement and building works at the parish church to increase capacity of the nave? I honestly have no idea. I'm sure somebody must have done. Angus or Sue?
I think I have a feeling that the book that Sue mentioned, Richard Morris, I have a feeling he might talk about this, because clearly, the size of the nave is critical, isn't it? I mean, going back to Sturchley, the little parish I was talking about in the East Shropshire coalfield, there is evidence for well, this admittedly is post-medieval. It's not in the period of colonization, but when the population suddenly takes off during the industrial period, they have to add a huge aisle to the church, so that the church is more or less, I think, trebled in size in order to take account of the increase in population. But that, I think there is, I think I'm right in saying, Sue might be able to correct me, but I think Richard Morris does actually talk about this.
Sue?
Oh, sorry, me. Yes, yes, he does. And the Royal Commission volumes and also the VCH volumes will talk about that for individual churches. And they'll talk about when aisles are taken down and or added, or naves are extended and so on. But I don't know of any study that is precise. The only one I can think of and that might be useful is the book on the English parish.
Oh, Pounds.
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 Yes. Norman Pounds's book on the history of the English parish, which he wrote when he was 90 and is amazing. But anyway, yes, it's full of detail. It might well be in there.
Okay, are there any more questions? There's a hand raising function if you go into the participants, which which obviously as I'm a co-host, I can't see. But if you put your hand up, I will be able to see that. Any further questions? No?
Alex Craven, I think.
Alex, yes, go on. Give me a second, Alex. I'll just unmute you.
Oh, I'm not unmuted. Am I muted? No.
You're not anymore, no.
Hello. Thanks for that, both of you. That was brilliant, and I learned loads and really, really fascinating. I'm going to watch it again because I'm sure I've missed so much of the detail. Sue talked a bit about floodplains, and that was really interesting. And the very simple but brilliant technique of colouring in the maps. That's fantastic. I'm going to do that for every VCH parish I work on now. But I wondered as well if floodplains are interesting, and if you talk about a little bit about floodplains, not floodplains, and watersheds.
Yes.
I'm sometimes struck by even very close, like even adjacent parishes. When you look at all of the documentary evidence and the connections different parishes have, where land ownership across several parishes in neighbouring districts, sometimes you can see a really strange, like sharp divide, even when they're adjacent to each other. And I think that sometimes that's about things like watersheds. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on watersheds and whether they impact on cultural and economic ties as much as on geological factors and topographical factors.
About watersheds.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Watersheds are really important. I didn't talk about them today because they're not, settlements tend not to be on the watersheds by and large. But very often parish boundaries follow watersheds. And very often county boundaries too, at least in my parts. I live in the lowlands and Angus, of course, lives in the uplands. So I hope he'll say something about this soon. Whether or not they are cultural and economic boundaries, I'm not so sure about that. I know there has been a book recently published on this, which covers my area, but that book takes things at such a small scale that it's impossible to test the hypothesis in detail. And so, no, I'm not terribly impressed by that. I mean, I think if you look at the Brian Roberts book, Region and Place, which is available for download online from the ADS website, they have a very interesting map which shows the catchments of the different major rivers of different parts of England, and those kinds of regions, those catchment areas, may well be cultural areas, but on the basis of at the level of individual watersheds, I'm not so sure. I don't know what, Angus, what you feel about this.
Well, I mean, what there are watersheds and watersheds, aren't there? I mean, as you say, the areas that I live in and know well, the watersheds tend to be such dominant, like this, that you're clearly going to have people on each side really being separated by them, and they become a natural boundary. So they become the parish boundaries almost. You can almost think of a geographical determinism there in areas like the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales. But if you look at, I mean, I was thinking of the East Shropshire coalfield again. That map of Dorley that I showed you, with the boundary, the parish boundary on the northwest side. I think I was pointing out all the spoil tips from the shallow mining, because the coal seams were near the surface there. If you were to I'd taken a wider area and looked at the neighbouring township to the northwest, exactly the same geology, more or less on the watershed. So the watershed has become the boundary between these two parishes. But the lordship on the north and west side has not allowed people to mine in the same way that the Lords of Dawley did. So you have that lunar landscape of spoil heaps and everything stops more or less along the line of the parish boundary. So there's a sort of, I think probably what you've got there is a watershed being a sort of, I say, a natural point to draw a boundary between two communities. That then becomes fixed. That then becomes the property boundary between two manors. And they go in different directions and lead to very, very different landscapes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's a couple more questions, actually 3 or 4 more questions in the chat. One of which is about planned settlement, which is pursue really, but is there any evidence of standard units of measurement and standard sizes of length or width of these plots of, I mean, across communities rather than within individual communities, because well, obviously within communities there clearly is, but
is there a standard width or
yeah.
length? No, I mean, no, there isn't. I mean, but I suppose the thing is, it probably varies from one part of the country to another. So I wouldn't like to be too definitive about it. In my part of the world, for the villain plots, they tend to be something between 1 and 2 acres, but they can be a little bit less or a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And the smallholder plots tend to be, roughly speaking, about 50% in area. But it's really, although when you're looking at the map, you're looking at lines which define properties. Actually, it's the area that's important. And so the thing to do is to go and find, for example, tithe maps are really useful at showing the areas of individual plots. And so you should be able to find that, the areas there and to see whether they conform. The only thing is to say about that is you're very unlikely to find, say, 20 as they were in Barrington, where everyone is exactly an acre. There'll be minor variations between them, but as long as they're all roughly speaking an acre, I think you can be content with that.
Okay, thank you. So Angus.
Yes, I mean the people have said, and I think that it's worth thinking of this, that when people are laying out, assuming we're talking about planning a village, if people are laying a village out, they're going to be using their local land rod, aren't they? And of course, we know that the land rod lengths varied across the country. Remember, this goes back to the question of customary acres. Customary acres varied from county to county, and the variation was caused by the use of different lengths of land rod. Now, those land rods would be what would be used to lay out the plots if a village was being laid out. And I think, again, it's something that Brian Roberts looked at to a certain extent, and people have looked at in some of the villages in the north of Yorkshire, June Shepherd and others. I think there are suggestions that some regular use of particular land rods can be found. And I think more generally, and this is a book I don't know very well, but hasn't John Blair talked about trying to identify units in Anglo-Saxon England of measurement units and standard units of measurement recurring in buildings and so on of Anglo-Saxon England?
Yes, it was Blair.
Okay, there's potentially quite an involved question, this, but which is how do we have any evidence of how parish boundaries in this period of particular expansion were decided? What do we know anything about the dispute? I mean, if we know about them at all, do we know about the dispute resolving mechanisms, and was this determined, by the church or by other factors?
Shall I go first on that one?
Yes.
Go on, Angus. Yeah.
Yeah. There are, of course, a lot of disputes. I mean, if you're taking a step back, you've got this land that hasn't been fully appropriated by anybody. You've got expanding population, people taking in more and more land, gradually coming up to an agreed boundary. Now, there are some places where you can almost see that happening in that sort of interdigitation between boundaries, where the land of one parish is intermixed with the land of another parish. And I think that's often found in places like areas of late surviving woodland, and perhaps particularly, and some to a certain extent of marshland as well. There are disputes. There are disputes not only about rent and ownership, but there are also disputes about tithes, because obviously the tithes of newly enclosed land are important and valuable. And they get resolved through the courts, by the church sometimes. A good way of looking at that, I think, is Chris Dyer's article on conflict in the landscape, the enclosure movement. I happen to have a copy right beside me. The enclosure movement in England, 1220 to 1349, which was in Landscape History in 2006, making the point that this really is such a major period of colonisation that it does lead to a lot of dispute and conflict.
About parish boundaries. I just think it's worth remembering that parishes are relatively late structures in the landscape. They're about who pays tithes to which church. And quite often those tithes were allocated by the major landowner within that holding, and which has now become a parish. So there are parishes which have secondary settlements which may themselves become parishes. Some of those parishes, some of the original parishes may be quite old, others may be quite new. And one of the things that one can do with a parish map of a region is to do that deconstructive analysis with parish boundaries, seeing which butt up against others, in order to try to work out which are the oldest units in your area, and which are those which have which are more recent. This thing about conflict across parish boundaries is really interesting, because you quite often find boundaries which are indistinct. Where they lie across a field or a common which is shared between two neighboring communities, which presumably is because those communities originally once unit, which has since been subdivided, and they couldn't quite work out how to make the boundary go across a particular area, and so they simply decided to share it between them. That's again, Norman Pounce's book is good on this.
Wonderful. Are there any? I mean, we've been. I'm aware that we've been sitting still for 2 hours now, and it's a long afternoon for people. But do we have any more final questions? Oh, yes, we do. I've got one from Graham Palmer, which in the 14th century, a place suddenly takes the suffix ton. Do you think it's like this indicates it's likely to be pasture land, or it's going to indicate something else entirely?
Ton, T-U-N, as pasture.
Yeah.
Well, ton is from an Old English word was T-U-N, which means the community of the community that occupies and exploits an area of land. And nowadays we're used to calling those units parishes, but of course parishes, as we just discussed, is an ecclesiastical term, but it's the land that belongs to that unit. I don't think that one would find that they are exclusively found in areas of grazing. Cambridgeshire, West Cambridgeshire is full of tons, and it's a very arable country. But it's quite an interesting idea to explore in your own area. It'd be quite fun to plot out, to see whether you could allocate tons to one or another kind of agricultural land use. I'm not familiar with them as for pasture, but it's possible. I don't know what there is in other parts of the country. Maybe Angus can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think ton is usually assumed, as you say, Sue, to be an Old English term, and therefore to be, as I was saying, one of the earlier place names, and to refer simply to a settlement or an estate. So it doesn't really tell you very much, I think, about land use. The question, I didn't quite catch the question, but it was the suggestion that this was a new name in the 14th century.
Yes, I think so.
Because that sounds unlikely, I have to say. I think I would want to go and see the various forms of that name, and to really one would need to have a place name scholar, which I'm not a place name scholar, to have a look at it, I think.
Unless you had a Newton place name.
Yes, that's true. Newton, yes, Newton is an exception. Yeah.
Sorry, pardon me. Okay. Well, and that if there are no more questions, well, let me just check. No. There are no more questions. If there are no more questions, I think it's only right to thank our speakers for their time and for their really fascinating talks. I've learned a lot, and one of the things I've learned is how much I've forgotten. And this has been really, really, don't forget, this will be available as a recording on the centre's web pages. And Angus's handout will be made available to you, anyone who signed up this session, by Gemma, who will email it round. And I will try and make that on the website as well. So thank you very much. We'll be doing more of these next year. I'm in the process of organising these. If you'd like to clap your speakers, if physically or using the clap button, that'd be great. Thank you very much for your time and for coming.
Thank you.